Hello, hello all, and welcome to the Castañeda-Jennings Lecture tonight. Before we begin, I wanted to offer a few friendly Zoom reminders to those of you watching on Facebook. Just hold on tight for a second as we go through these. There are several ways for you all to view the Zoom screen, as I'm sure you're familiar. In that upper right-hand corner, you can find a button named View. There you can switch between gallery view, where you can see all of our faces, or speaker view if you would like to focus just on the person speaking. The wonderful staff at CTS will do our best to keep everyone muted throughout this program, except those who are speaking. However, note at the end of the lecture, there will be an opportunity for question and answer. At that time, please unmute yourself so that you can be heard and seen and ask your questions. And finally, for those of us who like programs and like to see the run of show, we are going to drop a link to the program in the chat for your viewing. Thank you, Lisa Zook. And you'll be able to click on that and download that and follow along to sort of see who is speaking and what is up next. Again, thank you for joining us tonight for the Castañeda-Jennings Lecture. I will now turn it over to President Ray.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the 2021 Castañeda-Jennings Lecture. For more than 20 years, through the generosity of our colleague and beloved Professor Ted Jennings and his partner of life, Ronna Case, we've been offering a lecture that celebrates excellence in scholarship for gay, lesbian, transsexual, and queer students as a demonstration of our support. Not simply of people from that community, but actually support in terms of being a community. So I welcome you, and this year is especially poignant for us because this year it is not simply the Castaneda Lecture, it is the Castañeda-Jennings Lecture. So we are at once continuing a tradition of more than 20 years, at the same time honoring the wonderful, wonderful gift that was our friend, colleague, and mentor to so many, Dr. Ted Jennings. So I welcome you, and I thank you for being with us. And I also want to, while my colleague, Dr. Ken Stone will give a fuller introduction, I want to welcome Dr. Melissa Wilcox from the University of California, Riverside, who will be with us to give us a marvelous lecture. Again, friends, thank you and welcome. And now prepare yourselves for a wonderful evening, as well as a wonderful remembrance of a dear friend and colleague. Thank you.
Friends, as we are called into this space this evening together, may we hear these words of Reverend Anna Bladel, theologian in residence at Infleshed. Wild and wondrous creator of all, spirit of life and love and liberation, mother and lover and conspirator and friend, tender of possibility and dream. You have called us together in this time, in this place, and so here we are, full of wisdom and wondering, full of hope and fear, weariness and longing, passion and pain. Unleash your wild power in us, we pray. Deepen our connection with you and with each other. Deepen our capacity to hear the voices of those too often silenced, to honor the presence of those too often erased, to center the wisdoms of those too often pushed to the margins, that we might bear witness to the complex truths of our whole holy lives, and the complex needs of your beautiful, broken world. We remember those who have brought us to this place, who have labored with you, who have labored for us, to make a way out of no way, dreaming dreams, envisioning visions, both ancient and new. The communion of prophets, saints, and teachers, queer lovers, and freedom fighters, and fugitive dreamers, our ancestors. The great cloud of witnesses, those who whisper their wisdom in stories, songs, and poems, those who gave birth to movements and moments of liberation, of healing, of justice, of love. So come, Spirit, come. Convict us with curiosity. Convert us from complacency. Consecrate us with compassion. Conspire with us as we lean into the new life emerging from the destruction around us. May we listen into the chaos. May we lean into possibilities born of tears and sweat and dreams. May we open to your lure. May we remember our power. May we connect with our source. May we return always to what matters most, seeking justice, practicing kindness, deepening into solidarity with each other, with the divine, and with the entangled, interconnected web of holy life in which we live and move and have our being. May it be so. May we make it so. Amen, amin, ashe.
I want to thank CTS and President Ray and Marie Whitney and Lisa Zook and the tech people in Dow for gathering to honor Ted at this time. And I'm also grateful to those who will view this video later on and gather for a service, a memorial with other alums and friends and colleagues. On October 24th, 2020, Ted would have been 78 years old. He was born in Florida and educated in the South as well at Duke and Emory universities. And so he was a huge fan of the northern brilliant colors of autumn. He often took different routes walking home from CTS for the joy of discovering them on a new street. We met in the fall of 1972 when he came north as a young theologian. I was starting my second year as a D-Min student. We married in 1974 and went on an incredible sabbatical for 6 months in South Africa, Greece, and England in 1977. Twice we lived in California from 1978 to 1983. And from 1986 to 1999, in between, we lived in Mexico City as teaching missionaries at the Seminario Metodista Vice Camargo. In 1991, after writing a number of books in California, well, I served 2 small United Methodist churches and met undocumented worker Gilberto Castaneda, for whom there is a scholarship named at CTS. Ted was invited to return to CTS, this time as the senior theologian. He taught an amazing number of courses and served the seminary in many capacities and continued to write books until he retired in January of 2018. His work gave Ted much joy, purpose, and connection to other people. He loved teaching. He loved writing. Many former students remained friends. Being invited to teach in other countries and learn with former students encouraged him most in his later years, especially the numerous experiences in South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines. He made his last teaching tour to Korea and the Philippines in the fall of 2019. I ask for your prayers today as Families in Taiwan are grieving over the terrible, tragic bullet train accident outside of Taipei. I think probably was yesterday sometime, and Ted and I rode that train to the East Coast, to towns on the East Coast in 2015. So add prayers for those families to your other concerns, if you will, with me. On March 3rd, 2020, Ted experienced a major stroke while I was standing in front of him in our place in Acapulco. He told me he was having a stroke, and he said, "I love you, Rana," before slipping into a deep coma caused by blockage to his brainstem. He had wonderful medical care and support from our family friends, our former students, until his death on March 25th, 2020. After I returned to Chicago in April, former student and friend Kunitoshi Sakai discovered that the Chicago Parks Department would help us plant a memorial tree. Ted's is a Kentucky espresso coffee tree on the lakeshore in Hyde Park, just north of the point, near the huge iron wind sculpture that Ted liked so much, called Destino, by its creator, Mark Di Suvero. I am so grateful for the many, many expressions of support and the powerful, loving memories people have sent his former students, colleagues, and friends. Throughout this year, that has been of great support to me. Being Ted's partner, spouse, his lady for 46 years has been the deepest joy and privilege of my life.
Amen. Amen for Ted Jennings. Hello, my name is Chad Swickerath, and I am the Interim Vice President of Advancement at CTS. The lecture and award tonight, the scholarship, started with a group of people with a simple idea. It started with the idea that queer and trans folk matter, that LGBTQ people and families have a place in our congregations and our communities. You see, the Castañeda-Jennings Lecture, Award, and Scholarship started when a group of CTS people got together, found a bit of money, and established this annual lecture. And these are people that many of us know: Susan Thistlethwaite and Dow Edgerton, Rana Case, and the late Ted Jennings. They, and with the support of countless others, raised money to make this annual lecture, award, and scholarship possible. Every year possible. 20 plus years later, the legacy continues. CTS continues to lift up queer scholarship. We continue to celebrate LGBTQ students who are doing good work in our community. And it continues because people like you believe in that same simple idea that LGBTQ folks matter. Over the last month, the Office of Advancement has been running an online fundraising campaign to support queer initiatives and scholarship at CTS. You've seen the emails, I'm sure. Maybe you've seen the fundraising pages created and shared by graduates like Joey Rodil. Fundraising pages that started because these programs and scholarships are important. They have impact. Because professors like Ted Jennings made a difference for a queer student at CTS. I had every intention tonight to tell you to go to the page and give because we are this close to the goal. But when I opened the page before this lecture began, I saw that not only had the goal been met, but we had passed it. I have put the link to that page in the chat. Look and see. Witness it for yourself. Read the story. We have reached this goal because Ted touched the lives of students and graduates alike. He taught with compassion and sincerity. He witnessed to the seriousness of the gospel and furthered academic pursuits, all while promoting and advancing the simple idea that even the least of these, quoting Jesus, that even those at the margins of our churches and our communities matter. And so tonight I ask you, what more can we do? How much more of an impact can we make for queer students at CTS? If you know Ted, give in celebration of him. If you didn't know Ted, give because this work of LGBTQ inclusion is ongoing. that these programs and initiatives must continue, and scholarship matters for our students. Thank you.
Good evening. I am Stephanie Buchanan Crowder, Academic Dean here at Chicago Theological Seminary. At CTS, we are committed. In a world governed by sex and gender binaries, we are committed to liberate humanity from restrictive gender norms. We are committed. In a world governed by the presumption of heterosexual expression, we are committed to challenge homophobia, to celebrate lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and all individuals within the spectrum of human sex and sexuality. The Castañeda-Jennings Award goes to a student who embodies this commitment and the vision and values of our program in LGBTQ religious studies. This year's recipient is a queer, trans, feminist, activist, and hiker. They are the only child of a Presbyterian minister, and their religious background includes work with Presbyterian, Episcopal, Quaker, Methodist, and UCC churches in Northern Ireland, Mississippi, California, and the Pacific Northwest. They hold a master's degree in elementary education and work at an art museum. Tonight's honoree is a CTS MDiv student living in the Seattle area with their wife and a very spoiled dog. Join me in celebrating this year's Castañeda-Jennings Student Award recipient, Mac Buff. Mac, just say hello so that we all can see you.
Hello, and thank you, Dr. Crowder.
Good evening. My name is Ken Stone, and I'm very honored to be here tonight as we honor my friend Ted Jennings. I'm also very honored to introduce our speaker for the evening, Dr. Melissa Wilcox. I'll start with a more formal introduction and then make another observation or two. Dr. Wilcox is professor and Holstein Family and Community Chair of Religious Studies at the University of California, Riverside, and specializes in the study of gender, sexuality, and religion in the global North and global West. And Dr. Wilcox has published a number of books, some of which I have used in my classes. The books include Coming Out in Christianity, Religion, Identity, and Community, Sexuality and the World's Religions, Queer Women and Religious Individualism, Religion in Today's World, Global Issues and Sociological Perspectives, a fairly new book, Queer Religiosities, that I'm still digging into, and then maybe my favorite, Queer Nuns, Religion, Activism, and Serious Parody. I don't remember exactly when I first met Dr. Wilcox. We've sort of gone in and out of circles together, but one of the things I was thinking about in preparation for today is that Melissa is one of those scholars whose work in religious studies encourages me as a theological educator to stay honest about the nature of religion and queer issues. So after Dr. Wilcox speaks, we will have a few minutes for Q&A. But meanwhile, we look forward to Dr. Wilcox's lecture. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Ken, for that lovely introduction, and what a moving space to step into. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being a part of this today, from whatever living room, dorm room, bathroom, closet, attic, office, chapel of reliquaries, park bench, hotel room, backyard, car, train, or maybe if you're lucky, even coffee shop or pub you've settled into for our time together. The pandemic has done odd things with space, making cozy into comforting and wide open into threatening or promising, putting old spaces to new use, like when my students can only get peace and quiet for class in the bathroom of their home, or when people flock to gutted shopping malls, not for new clothes, but for a shop that offers a new lease on life. I just got my second dose yesterday, so for once I have an excuse if I seem incoherent. I am so very honored to have been nominated to give the Castañeda-Jennings Lecture. And while I appreciate the chance for deeper interaction with a live streaming audience than I might have had if the lecture were taking place in person, I also grieve the loss of the in-person connection with old friends and new ones that always takes place when I travel to speak, and that I was very much looking forward to when planning for this event began nearly a year and a half ago now. Those small daily interactions that seem too unimportant for a phone call or a text, and definitely not worth more Zoom fatigue, provide the minor nudges and course corrections that sustain many of us, that build or repair relationships in tiny ways so that we don't have major building or repair to do later. On Sundays right now, my partner and I attend my mom's Unitarian Universalist church with her online over brunch at her house. And a few weeks ago, one of that congregation's high school seniors talked about those small interactions as the unnoticed mortar that holds together the entire beautiful mosaic. I love that metaphor. I miss the mortar, and I look forward to the chance to lay it again, or for the first time with many of you in the future that still seems like a wistful hope right now. My topic for today is grounded in scholarship coming out of another time of pandemic losses and newly emergent hope. At its core is the very definition of religion itself. Now, if you've traveled in religionist circles for any period of time, perhaps especially among those of us who lean more towards what's sometimes called the descriptive analytical side of the field, you already know that we actually have no idea what religion really is. Or maybe it's more accurate to say that we have too many ideas about what it is. None of them cohere with each other. And for every definition, there are at least 5 exceptions: practices, beliefs, texts, organizations, and the like that are widely considered religious, but that don't fit the definition. Now, at first glance, it's a little funny that religious studies scholars of all people can't decide what religion is. But do we ask gender studies scholars to precisely define what gender is in a universal sense, or political scientists to define politics? Queer theorists don't even bother pretending. It's part of the very definition of queer theory for some that queer evades definition. This happens because these terms, including religion, don't have some sort of universal truth or meaning. The European philosophers a few hundred years ago, who developed out of an existing term the concept of religion as it's most commonly used today, thought it was a widespread, eventually understood to be universal human phenomenon that could be identified in any human society, past or present, detached from other aspects of that society, and studied in comparison with others, almost as one might compare the anatomy of a canine leg to that of an equine one. Yet, if this were so, every language, past and present, would have a word that references this concept, like every language has a word for leg. That's not the case. Nevertheless, this way of understanding the word religion has spread around the world. The constitutions of many governments address the role of religion in the state. People argue for and against religious freedom. Ask your 3 closest friends who aren't religionists what religion is, and you'll probably get answers having to do with organizations and institutions, dogmas and rituals, and deities, although these individual definitions are often also shaped by the elements most emphasized in the tradition or traditions each person knows best. As a Supreme Court justice once famously remarked about pornography, with religion too, we know it when we see it, or at least we think we do. The same can be said for spirituality, a word that's typically used, whether more positively or more negatively than religion, to refer to individual experiences with the sacred. Religionists tend to consider all of these things and more as being under our purview, as part of religion broadly construed. But what happens when a group of people claims certain things, practices, beliefs, objects, spaces, experiences, to be religious or spiritual, and the broader we don't know it when we see it? What should religionists do with religious experiences that don't fit within our expected parameters of what properly constitutes, quote unquote, religion? In short, the question that I've been asking increasingly often and increasingly demandingly, is this: who gets to define religion and why, and what are the consequences of this power? As I was preparing to write this lecture, I thought a lot about when these questions first arose for me, particularly in the context I'm talking about today. Sean Crawley recently posted a really thoughtful commentary on social media about how many of his current projects have been years in the making, not just because research and writing take time, but because the questions we ask and the answers we offer require years and even decades to develop. We return to them intermittently, ponder, maybe write a paper or two, and let the creative and analytical process keep going in the background. I think that happened for me with this material. It all started with Mark Jordan, doesn't everything? But to take the backstory first, I'm the only person I know, and maybe the only person, period, who learned feminist theory and queer analysis in undergraduate religious studies classes in the early 1990s. It was at Stanford, and all too predictably, both of my brilliant teachers and another path-clearing scholar and now good friend were all denied tenure after I graduated. So when I picked up Mark's book, The Silence of Sodom, shortly after finishing my PhD, at an institution where the faculty were fantastically supportive but didn't always know what to do with me, where the women's studies program still didn't count your work as belonging if it included any genders other than cis women, where all of my chimerical sociologist religionist friends and I attended sociology of religion conferences where straight people talked to other straight people about what still other straight people thought about queer people, and queer voices were utterly absent. Mark's work was a profoundly queer ray of sparkly rainbow hope in what felt like a dully straight cisgender field. His passing comment about the prevalence of Catholics in dungeons has stuck with me for over 20 years. Or maybe it all starts with Ibrahim Farajage, one of two scholars I'll mention today and more whom I'm not engaging, who left us too young and left us all grief-stricken and yearning for more of their work. At my first AAR annual meeting, 1995, I think it was, I found myself lost not in a sea of brilliant and exciting work, but in a sea of cisgender straight Christians. I was doing my MA in a similar sea at the time and felt more than a little discouraged about my future in the field as someone who spoke certain dialects of Christianity relatively fluently, but wasn't a practitioner and was getting increasingly annoyed by the constant presumptions that I was. Then I went to a session, and I think this is where Ken and I eventually connected, of what was called at the time the Gay Men's Issues in Religion group, and Ibrahim was on the panel. I honestly don't even remember what he said, so much as the fact that it was different from anything else I'd heard that weekend. The excitement about religious studies that I'd felt as an undergrad falling sideways into the field from a major in molecular biology returned. Attending the AAR in the late 1990s, soaking up every minute of the joint gay men's, lesbian feminist program unit reception, and that binary is another story we don't have time for, in windowless hotel basements behind closed doors where a hat was literally passed to pay for the cheap cheese cubes, I got to know others whose work sparked ideas that have been percolating in my thoughts ever since. Donald Boisvert, also sadly now gone, was writing about cruising as sacred. Paul Gorel, who left the academy but stayed in touch, was writing on circuit parties as communitas. People gave papers on leather and the sacred. Roger Sneed made an offhand comment I'll never forget about discovering his sexuality through comics. Religion in the Gay Men and Religion group was exceeding the boundaries set by a straight, cisgender, sometimes even homonormative field. And I was not only intellectually riveted, but powerfully moved. I didn't have the words then, although they did, I'm sure. But I can say today that what I was seeing and hearing was queer and increasingly also trans bodies being treated as sacred without having to leave their flesh at the door. I think sacralizing culturally desacralized bodies is earth-shattering and life-saving. I think I've known that all along. It's what brought me to tears when I first attended a Metropolitan Community Church service as a budding ethnographer. It's what made me shriek with joy when I saw Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence in the LA Pride Parade decades ago, before the LA House was even founded. It's what returns me again and again to the activist art of people like Renee Cox, Alma Lopez, David Edwards, who created this AIDS pieta that graces the opening pages of my book, Queer Nuns, and Max Koo, whose artwork graces the cover. It's why I teach my course on queer religiosities every other year, even when I'm canceling other classes for administrative course releases, and why I never let anyone else teach it. It's why I wrote the textbook of the same name. It's why I do nearly everything I do as a scholar. So it cuts to the core of my being when queer forms of engagement with the sacred are dismissed by the broader field as not really religious. Not because these are my forms of the sacred, but because these are my people. Ibrahim published mostly articles and spent the latter part of his career as an administrator. Donald published his ideas in a book through Pilgrim Press. It likely reached a pretty wide audience of practitioners, but was barely taken up by other scholars, especially outside of theological circles. Paul's work appeared in article form in a few places, like books with the word gay in their titles, that in the early 2000s virtually assured that they would go no further than queer circles. Mark Jordan is of course far better known, but also has had his influence limited by homophobia. More to the point, his work is all too often regarded as simply being about Catholicism. That comment on dungeons has largely remained in the basement. And other authors writing in this period about queer folks encountering the sacred in spaces not typically named religious or spiritual focused most of their work elsewhere. Performance studies scholar and queer color theorist D. Patrick Johnson wrote lyrically of bars as religious spaces in the late 1990s, for instance. And scholar of US religion Thomas Peterson wrote what is, to my knowledge, only the second published descriptive analytical article ever on religion in leather communities. All this work on a topic that resonates so often and so deeply with the queer and trans audiences I speak to, silenced like words shouted into the wind by a scholarly field and all too often an assimilative community politics that insists that this is not real religion. In Given to the Goddess, a thoughtful and insightful book about South Indian Devadasis and the economic and political cross currents that lash across their bodies and their lives, anthropologist Lucinda Ramberg cuts right to the heart of the problem. Religion and sex, she explains, and here she means embodied, fleshy sex, have always been tangled up in each other. But this is not how those domains are understood in modernity. For moderns, sex is secular, a matter of reproduction, perhaps of pleasure, and of the risk of contagion and population to be managed by the clinic and the state. Religion, in contrast, has no sex. It's asexual, or at least it should be. Sex in the house of religion can only be violence or a scandal. As theorists of power, from post-colonial to post-structuralist, feminist to critical race to queer and trans theorists have been telling us for decades, minoritized bodies are controlled in part through being defined as sexually aberrant. While in a few cases, this defining aberrancy is asexual, the vast majority of the time, it's hypersexual. Minoritized bodies, in other words, are sexualized bodies. But if, as Ramberg argues, sex and so-called proper religion don't go together in societies that fancy themselves modern or are trying to become such, then minoritized bodies will never be considered properly religious in such societies without being carefully and explicitly desexualized. Straight, cis, white, evangelical Christians, as Amy Derogatis tells us, can put their Bibles on the bedside table and get it on with God in the room. But queer and trans folks, BIPOC folks, people with disabilities, people from marginalized religions, including marginalized forms of Christianity, they'd all better leave either the sacred or the flesh at the door. So the dominant folks, the ones who make the laws that control all our bodies, they get to have their bodies be sacred, while the rest of us struggle with being either desexualized or demonic. Lil Nas said it graphically a few weeks ago and shocked everyone who hasn't been paying attention or who's been so invested in the effort to desexualize in order to sacralize that they never even saw another path. I wish I could tell you that these are larger societal dynamics, that scholars are insightful enough to press beyond such limited perspectives to breach the artificial barriers between minoritized flesh and the sacred. But clearly that's not the case. After all, when was the last time there were real fleshy human bodies present in some way in an academic paper you heard or read, even in queer or trans studies in religion? Every time the body comes up, it seems, most academics shriek and flee back into the brain. Bodies are abstract, conceptual in most scholarship, not fleshy. Flesh, heat, wetness, panting, groaning, that's not the stuff of the study of religion, even if someone does cry out, "Oh God," in the middle of it. And my question is, why not? I think sometimes my questions are treated as rhetorical devices, as less direct or literal than I intend them to be. Maybe this is because people aren't prepared for the literal meaning of the question or can't even comprehend it as a proper scholarly question. So I suppose this is a sign of their respect for me as a scholar. That's not a very scholarly question, and this person is a serious scholar, so the question must just be a rhetorical device. No, I actually want to know why we can't write about actual flesh, why religion has to be so intensely cognitive when so many people don't experience it that way. Why, as I keep asking, and no one has yet answered, we don't take cock worship seriously as a form of worship. That's a genuine, serious, scholarly question. And its awkward or horrified dismissal by most scholars of religion not only betrays their profound discomfort with the flesh, it betrays a number of sexually minoritized communities by making their own sense of the sacred scandalous, inappropriate, and unbefitting of a serious scholar. Well, I'm sorry, but I intend to keep throwing these fleshy questions at the gates of scholarship until they collapse and let my people in. In the meantime, though, I want to turn from describing and critiquing the barriers to queer and trans inclusion in the broader study of religion and focus instead on the world in which I prefer to live, the thriving circles of trans and queer studies in religion, and the important insights we stand to gain when we build upon the important work of people like E. Patrick Johnson, Mark Jordan, Donald Boisvert, Paul Gorel, more recently, Jafari Sinclair Allen, Vincent Cervantes, Elizabeth Perez, Leanne Hildebrand, and the many, many trans and queer grad students who've written and presented papers on religion, flesh, and sex over the years, only to have their committees direct them away from making that work any more public than it already was. I want to turn in the second half of my talk to over a decade of work with the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence and to my new and very much still nascent under the quarantine book project on spirituality in queer and trans, leather, and BDSM communities. A word first on method. Not so much the painstaking details about hours in the field, pages of field notes and transcripts, average length of interviews, and so on, but the interpretive perspective that undergirds my work. Sometime in the 1990s, anchored especially by a book edited by David Hall that was published in '97, religionists, and especially those studying religion in the US, began to talk a lot about lived religion. Simply put, this is religion as it's lived, as opposed to religion as it's prescribed. Different from the older term popular religion, which is also problematic because of the classist overtones of labeling anything popular, that is, of the people or of the masses. A lived religion approach can focus on how anyone, from religious leaders to school children, lives out their religion. Lived religion approaches allow a scholar like sociologist Meredith McGuire to represent Roman Catholicism through the lens of a woman who keeps her saints in the kitchen so she can see them all day and throws them in the back of her kitchen drawers as punishment when they fail to follow through on her petitions. Lived religion aligns with the approach of filmmakers like Sandy Simcha Dubowski and Parvesh Sharma, who represent gay, lesbian, and queer Orthodox Jews and Muslims as Jews and Muslims, full stop. Lived religion approaches leave the definition of religion in the hands of the participants rather than in the head of the author or filmmaker or in the hallowed halls of religious hierarchy. The logical outcome of methods based in lived religion perspectives is that we don't define religion. Rather, we adjust our definition of religion with our growing and shifting knowledge as we discover how those we learn from, whether through conversations, through ancient archival materials, through art or literature, or in other forms, how they define religion, or perhaps today's spirituality for themselves. The logical consequence of lived religion methods is they expose the limits of religionists' capacity for comprehension as just that, their own limits, not the failings of a community that understands religion in a way they can't accept or fathom. So beyond the importance of respectfully and accurately portraying the lives, experiences, and perspectives of trans and queer folks, a lived religion approach holds the potential to radically change the study of religion, as scholars are forced to revisit taken for granted understandings in light of minoritized communities that reclaim and repurpose religious roles, practices, and perspectives. Sorry about that, making sure I still have a voice by the time we get to the end. One particularly clear example of my point here is connected to the role of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence as nuns. The Sisters, for anyone unfamiliar with them, are a more than 40-year-old religiously unaffiliated international order of non-celibate, self-described queer nuns of all genders and sexualities, although cisgender and genderqueer gay men continue to predominate in their ranks. Curious about their understanding of themselves and aware of claims by both fans and foes that the Sisters mock nuns, I asked every sister I interviewed whether they consider themselves a nun. Almost to a person in one form or another, they said yes. A few from predominantly Catholic cultures in which a nun is cloistered and a sister works in the world corrected me and said they're sisters, not nuns. But in a way, they're the exception that proves the rule. Why do the Sisters consider themselves nuns? Because in an amusing and likely unintentional reiteration of the oversimplified Reformation, counter-Reformation distinctions between Protestants and Catholics, the Sisters do the work. They minister, as nuns do. They educate, including, a few told me in varying states from profound seriousness to grinning amusement, sex education. They provide emotional and sometimes spiritual support. They heal. This particular concept of nuns will be very familiar to some of you and less so to others. For those with whom it doesn't fully resonate, this might be because of negative educational experiences turned with such alacrity into cheap and corny pornography over the years, or because you're thinking of different nuns. In English, we use the same term for female religious renunciants worldwide, regardless of whether they're Catholic, Episcopalian, Buddhist, Jain, or another tradition. Yet ask many people to describe a nun, and the answer will indicate not only a specifically Roman Catholic nun, but also a figure less from reality than from popular culture. If you know anything about gay culture, in fact, you can probably guess which popular nun figure seems to resonate the most with the roles adopted by the Sisters. I've become perhaps overly fond of the joke that the Sisters are the love children of Julie Andrews, Maria von Trapp, and the drag queen Divine. So far, this seems like hilarious parody. Queer folks dressed as nuns in white pancake makeup and often high femme drag, sporting purses overflowing with condoms and safer sex kits. What could be funnier? And the Sisters use that parody too to castigate religious homophobia, as in this 1987 mass against papal bigotry in San Francisco. In a press conference a few days before the mass, Sister Vicious Power-Hungry Bitch, now Sister Vishnu in another story for another talk, made a big media splash by nailing the order's objections against the church to the door of a San Francisco cathedral with a Lee press-on fingernail in protest against the upcoming visit of Pope John Paul II. Early Australian sisters carried the head of a homophobic evangelical politician on a platter in an early pride parade. Somewhat more recently, sisters who'd gathered in San Francisco for the order's 30th anniversary celebration in 2009 staged a die-in as official Vatican pronouncements were read from strips of paper fed through the mouth of an oversized papier-mâché head of Pope Benedict. So given all of this raucous and irreverent parody of the male hierarchy, what are we to do with the sisters' claim to be nuns? That phrase male hierarchy is the key here, because although they admit to some reservations about individual nuns or orders, across the board, the sisters have profound respect for Roman Catholic nuns and treasure their occasional alliances with them. More than one sister mistily told me of being approached by Catholic nuns who understood the order's mission, respected their work, and identified it as similar to their own. Far from mocking nuns, the sisters repeatedly and earnestly insist that they're emulating them. In the Order of Benevolent Bliss in Portland, Oregon, when I was spending significant time there, it was common for sisters to explain to curious bystanders that they're simply another of the several types of nuns in the world. Sister Chrissy Fiction observed to me once, you know, the Roman Catholics, they haven't cornered the market on nuns. There's Episcopalian nuns, there's Buddhist nuns, and there's us. So there's all different kinds of nuns. Many sisters say that they do the benevolent work of nuns in communities that nuns don't typically serve. So the sisters are nuns. They don't just claim to be nuns, as many people put it. That wording automatically introduces a tone of reasonable doubt. They claim, but do we really know? A lived religion approach, though, encourages us to take the sisters at their word, rather than enact the epistemological violence of claiming to know better than they do what they really are. At first glance, saying that the sisters are nuns, full stop, seems interesting to many people, but not particularly remarkable. That is, until they consider the full ramifications of this statement. If the sisters are nuns, and if we accept this as fact and without caveat, as I think we should, then some serious rethinking of the category of nun is in order. Not in all areas, mind you, because the very aspects the sisters point to, like service and ministry, do line up pretty well, as do their initiation processes and ranks, which were modeled on Roman Catholic orders. But to hear some people tell it, the areas of the definition that do need to be changed are the most sacrosanct ones. Perhaps unsurprisingly, here we are again, back with the flesh. If the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence are also nuns, as they say they are, and as we're therefore bound to respect if we're taking a lived religion approach, then the definition of nun can no longer automatically include either celibacy or female assignment at birth. Femininity is a little trickier since most sisters present as feminine regardless of their identity or expression in their secular lives, but those presumptions too have been challenged in recent years. I think what many people, both observers and scholars alike, find unsettling or even shocking about the sisters is that they bring sexually active bodies, and indeed bodies that are culturally defined as permanently and ineradicably sexual, into a role that's made sacred precisely by intensely and constantly desexualizing the culturally sexualized bodies that traditionally inhabit those robes. When nuns are no longer celibate and no longer necessarily female, the world seems to some people to lose its center. And some devolve into viciously homophobic and transphobic rhetoric, almost as though by putting on the habits of nuns, the sisters had invaded the nuns' very bodies. We're not very far here from the fantasized trans threat in the bathroom, and the panic level is nearly as high, especially among conservative Catholics, regardless of gender identity or sexual orientation. But if the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence are nuns, if they're members of the category of nun who are not celibate and not women assigned female at birth, then we have to approach that entire category with greater nuance and detail. Even without the sisters, we stand in need of a reminder to do this, because the very association of religious nuns with Hollywood nuns, be they Julie Andrews or Tilda Swinton in the popular imaginary, can lead unsuspecting religious studies scholars into the temptation to draw lines between the real and the unreal. We learn more about religion in the contemporary world by asking why audiences found Tilda Swinton's magical, Orientalist, and whitewashed image of a barely disguised Buddhist nun in Doctor Strange to be convincing as a religious, or better yet, spiritual figure, than we do by dismissing her character as not a real nun. The same holds true for the sisters. Furthermore, by taking the sisters at their word, we make another critically important move. We use our social capital as scholars to bolster for once, rather than dismiss, the sacralization of queer and trans bodies. Some religious studies scholars, and here I'm intentionally distinguishing such scholars from theologians and ethicists, some religious studies scholars formed and hardened into a time-honored mold of positivist claims to objectivity balk at the idea of affirmation. Accusations of normativity and confessionalism gathered in their fists at the ready. But I do not believe there is any neutral ground here. In the face of a culture that persistently desacralizes and even actively demonizes trans and queer flesh, to remain silently neutral is to accept complicity. The sacralization of marginalized flesh comes further to the fore when we turn to the topic of religion and spirituality in leather and BDSM communities. That acronym stands for bondage, discipline, dominance, submission, sadism, and masochism. And here, even more than with the sisters, I've already experienced a profound bifurcation of responses from audiences, despite the project being at such an early stage. In most queer and trans contexts, save perhaps for people still troubled by the feminist sex wars of the 1980s, when I mention that I'm studying religion and spirituality in queer and trans, leather, and BDSM communities, there's instant recognition. And not just in those communities. Friends who don't travel predominantly in queer and trans circles have popped up recently to tell me that they're kinksters and are really excited about my work. The connection to all of these folks is obvious and almost goes without saying, but they're also keenly aware that it's been almost entirely ignored by the descriptive analytical side of religious studies. On the other hand, with few exceptions, though notable ones and ones for which I'm very, very grateful, they know, I think, who they are, religious studies scholars outside of these communities respond to my current project more as yet another outrageous stunt. First, they tried to shock people by talking about cock worship, they seem to be thinking, and now they've really gone over the top. Shock value has really never been the goal of my research. My goal has always been to take trans and queer people at their word and to teach my cis and straight colleagues to do the same, to press them to recognize that our communities are important to the study of religion. Yet in taking folks at their word, I've often fallen sideways into shocking more mainstream audiences. And I try to learn from those experiences, not so as to avoid them in the future, mind you, but so as to better understand the attitudes towards religion, sex, and flesh that hover below the radar until provoked. I've gotten a bit less naive since I enthusiastically assigned an article about a Passover Seder sex party and arrived to class to find, much to my surprise, a profoundly uncomfortable and disturbed group of progressive queer and ally students. Then again, only a few years ago, I was contentedly scanning condom packs from the sisters in my office at UC Riverside when I had the sudden and bemused realization that most religionists don't typically spend their workdays doing such things. Sometimes I still struggle to see beyond my own reality. So then what is it that so many trans folks, queer folks, and kinksters know about religion, leather, and BDSM that cis, straight, and vanilla religionists could stand to learn? Here I have to rely much more on the small amount of existing literature and a significant amount of practitioner writing, including but not limited to theological work and including some that's unpublished, since my research in this area was approved by UCR's Institutional Review Board just last summer in the midst of the quarantine. But I think a few observations can already be made, even as many more remain to be thoroughly developed. The one at the forefront of my mind these days is a real paradigm shift for me that came from my Zoom conversations with Peter Fisk, the only person I've interviewed so far for this project. Peter, a lifelong Leatherman, has a keen sense of his legacy and the importance of his story. He was a delight to speak with, not only because of his kindness and generosity, but also because he had so much to share. When he slowed down a bit and I was able to ask questions, I was especially curious to understand in more detail the strong connection between spirituality and BDSM in Peter's life. I wanted to know more precisely how the two connected. Was it through belief, experience, embodiment? It definitely wasn't through a specific tradition, because Peter's spiritual practice has shifted over the course of his life and draws on a number of different traditions. I was seeking the intersection point, wanting to trace the warp of BDSM practice and the weft of spirituality in the weaving. But each time I asked the question, trying to clarify what I wanted to know, the answer didn't satisfy my curiosity. Finally, I realized that the question was wrong. When I suggested this to Peter and explained my thinking, he agreed. I was trying to analyze the intersection or interweaving of the two as though they were separable, but for him at least, they're not. Some things can't be pulled apart and analyzed without distorting the whole. I'm reminded here of Jesper Puar's turn from intersectionality to assemblage to think about the connections between flesh and fabric, especially but not solely in the context of Sikh turbans, which for many Sikhs can't be conceptually disconnected from Sikh embodiment, from flesh. Peter's gentle refusal of my unwitting efforts to bifurcate his experiences challenges all religionists to examine our assumptions, lingering, no doubt, from the very definitions of religion that ground our field, that religion can be isolated from other aspects of life, can be pulled apart from the flesh without irreversible distortion and damage. One more vocal cord break. Another question that tugs at me is one of categorization. Mira Zussman and her pseudonymous co-author Ann Pierce are the only scholars I know of, other than Thomas Peterson, to have published work about religion in queer BDSM and leather communities from a descriptive analytical perspective. Their article, published in 1998 in the journal Anthropology of Consciousness, opens by pointing out the similarities between BDSM and religious practice. They write that bondage and the induction of varied stimuli, including pain, to achieve altered states of consciousness are familiar themes in religious experience. They can be central to SM play. They're using an older term. This was published in the 1990s. Farther down the same page, they expand on this claim with religiously specific detail. Judaism, they write, is thoroughly obsessed with binding, bondage, slavery, dominance, submission, and the paradoxes of freedom. We bind our bodies with leather straps, tefillin, to reaffirm our connection with God. We bind the Torah or Holy Scripture itself in the swaddling cloth of our young. We bind our hair and even the strands of our sacred Sabbath bread. In Christianity, we need look no further than the cross. Christ stripped bare, then covered with a scarlet robe, crown of thorns placed upon his head, mocked and flogged, and finally the parting of his garments as he's crucified. These are images employed not only in SM practice, but also in its literature. There are as well pervasive depictions in medieval and Renaissance art of the entranced Christ immersed in subspace upon the cross. To many listeners, these claims are blasphemous. And yet, even to acknowledge this perspective, and worse yet, to foreground it, is to privilege a straight, cis, and/or vanilla audience over the people discussed by Zussman and Pierce, and over Pierce herself, who used a pseudonym in this article because she's also a BDSM practitioner. To people who experience BDSM play as sacred, these are not sacrilegious connections, but sacred ones, exciting not because of transgression, but because of recognizing their own experiences within their sacred traditions. And indeed, Zussman and Pierce aren't the only ones to note the striking similarity between binding tefillin and binding other forms of black leather. S.J. Krasnow has more recently written about a queer Talmud camp where this same theme was raised in a workshop. Such work should serve to remind us of the importance of taking people at their word, the importance of letting them tell us what religion is, rather than imposing our own definition or privileging someone else's. The importance of not erecting barriers beyond which we refuse to go with the definition of this socially constructed concept. The importance of the fact that complicity can sometimes look suspiciously neutral. But the question I find more interesting in the context of the parallels drawn by Zussman and Pierce and by many BDSM practitioners themselves is how these boundaries get constructed between practices that are so phenomenologically similar. Why is Christ's cross not the same as the St. Andrew's cross, for instance? Wouldn't there be something potentially theologically interesting in reading questions of power and consent across the two contexts? Why do so many people balk at drawing a connection between binding tefillin and creating intricate knots of soft rope down someone's arms? Why precisely do some people consider submission to God different from submission to a dom? There are tensions here around the divide between sex and the sacred, and the flesh provides a bridge. I think this bridging is what frightens people. It opens up a passage between the two that many experience as being out of place. Out of place. Beside oneself, ecstatic, ecstasy. Another question that tugs at me has to do less with the capacity of BDSM practices to induce spiritual experiences, less to do with the parallels between religious and BDSM techniques for altering consciousness, and more to do with the persistent presence of religious themes in BDSM play. This question takes us back to where I started, with Mark Jordan and Catholics in Dungeons. I'm not being incredulous, but simply curious when I ask why exactly religious themes are hot. When I mention this question in casual conversation with other scholars, I often get a very pat answer. It's about taboo and transgression, they tell me. Simple as that. Haven't you read Bataille? Been there, done that. But I don't think it's about taboo or transgression. I think, at least in these contexts, that such pat answers are simplistic and reductive. Consider the question I raised earlier about the cross, for example. It takes very little knowledge of Christian history to understand that emulation of Christ's suffering is only transgressive when it violates the social norms of a particular culture or religious order. If you're the wrong person getting stigmata, or they're too bloody or too frequent, or you're too zealous in your mortification of the flesh, you might be transgressing. But that's also not hot, it just gets you in trouble. Everyday people too, who don't bleed regularly from their hands or welcome sickness as a chastisement of the flesh, can engage in such emulation. Just a few weeks ago, when driving down a major thoroughfare near my home, I saw a man trudging down the sidewalk with a wooden cross on his shoulders, followed by an entourage of about a dozen people who were dressed in the way that most contemporary artists today picture people of Jesus' time dressing. This isn't an uncommon sight here during Lent. Now, I'm not arguing that everyone or even most people who end their evening on a St. Andrew's cross are emulating Christ. The vast majority are doing nothing of the sort. But those for whom there are resonances, between the two crosses, I'm suggesting that what makes that resonance hot is not transgression, despite prominent theories to the contrary. I would suggest instead that there are at least two other sources for people's affective and embodied reactions to religious themes in BDSM. One I mentioned above, the direct connection between the sacred and one's own embodied experience and the sacralization of minoritized bodies. What better way to make BDSM on Shabbat a mitzvah than to trace connections between the bindings on your partner's arms and those on the arms of your ancestors? The other explanation, relevant I think especially in the case of religious figures understood as homophobic, is subversion. Putting the figure of the Roman Catholic priest, not individual priests who aren't necessarily homophobic or transphobic themselves, putting the figure in a queer and trans dungeon symbolically reconfigures an officially transphobic and homophobic tradition into one that literally embraces queer and trans bodies. Above all else, this is power play. And if there's one thing people in the scene can tell you, it's that power is hot. Transgression is about breaking rules. And I'm not trying to argue that breaking rules doesn't sometimes cause a rush or even arousal, but it's not simply the breaking of rules, violating a prohibition, that makes priests' collars in a dungeon hot. I don't even think it's the symbolic contravention of priestly celibacy. It's the subversion of the cultural narrative of Roman Catholic homophobia. It's the power play whereby the Vatican's symbolic representative is claimed for themselves by the very communities the Vatican keeps insisting that God can't bless. It's not breaking the rules that's hot, at least not when it comes to religion. It's having the last laugh. And none of this would work if the figure in question didn't hold a certain amount of cultural power. On holy cruising grounds, in sacred subspace, trans and queer communities craft their own understandings of the sacred. Pushed out all too often from the sacred spaces of their youth, allowed back in at times only when stripped of their flesh and their desires, some trans and queer folks find their deepest connection to the sacred in spaces where they can insistently reclothe themselves in their flesh. Not just the skin, but the ripples of desire that course through it on the dance floor, at the circuit party, in the moonlit woods, cuffed to a cross. While scholarly cisnormativity, heteronormativity, and even homonormativity lead those academics who aren't also in these scenes to dismiss such experiences of the sacred out of hand, and often lead those who are part of these scenes to draw sharp lines between their embodied and their intellectual lives, such evasions and refusals Such commitments to only take certain religious subjects at their word reinforce the erotophobia and the profound discomfort with the flesh that keep non-dominant bodies and desires marginalized in the academy. It's long past time for religionists to walk our talk, to attend carefully to all claims to the sacred, to relinquish our squeamishness about flesh and sex, if we are truly to understand this human experience called religion that's blossomed from a concept of our own invention. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Melissa. That was wonderful. And we do have some time for Q&A, if that's okay with you. We've got a lot of people on the call, so I've asked a couple of people to help me sort of identify questions in case I miss them. But I'm actually going to start with one. It's going to start like a very obvious question, but maybe go in a slightly different direction. I'm very taken with your attention to space and dungeon, bathroom, basement, cruising ground, circuit party, windowless rooms at the AAR, and also how you tied that to fleshy bodies and sex. And the obvious question would be, do you have your views about this change during pandemic when a lot of us have been stuck in the same spaces, for months? But the less obvious question, I think, has to, I mean, we know queer people have found ways to use technology to get around, those limitations. But the less obvious question would be how that ties into the BDSM interest, because that seems much harder to navigate when people aren't literally together, physically together. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that and the creativity of queer folk in finding ways to work around those limitations.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Again, to a certain extent, as somebody whose research is predominantly ethnographic, I'm limited by how widely I've been able to work with people during the pandemic. This is a terrible time to be studying BDSM. I have been able to interview people, but just, or one person, and had other people volunteer that I haven't been able to follow up with yet, but just sort of building the network, the communal and community connections that are necessary for doing this kind of research in a community that's rightly suspicious of academics. That takes time, and it takes a lot of in-person work. So I'm not ducking the question, but rather saying that in typical circumstances, I would be turning to all of the interviews I've done and casual conversations that I've had with people about all of this, and that's very limited. But and what casual conversations I have had have not been on the record, so I can't tell specific stories. But what I can say is that you're absolutely right. Trans and queer folks are very, very creative, and in general, people in the scene are very creative. So when you're thinking, on the one hand, yes, the body and the flesh are so critically important, and the interaction, right, touch is so critically important in so many scenes, but so is power. And power play can be done without touching. Power play can be done 6 feet distance, particularly the ways in which many DOMs work with arousing and not fulfilling desire. Well, how about social distancing to help with that? So yeah, I've definitely talked to people who've both been profoundly frustrated and really grieving the loss of community, as many of us have been. And here we're talking about sexual communities that for whom those interpersonal connections in that community is so critically important. And I've also talked to people about just amazing levels of creativity that have allowed them to continue those connections and continue those relationships in ways that are safe during this pandemic, just as they did in ways that were safe during the prior one. We have gay leather communities to thank for a lot of our safer sex practices that we have today. I should say gay, lesbian, queer, trans, bi communities to thank for a lot of those practices. And, you know, and it's happening again.
Thank you for that. Okay, I want to open it up and I'm going to try to navigate the large group we have here, which is wonderful that we have a large group, and see what kinds of questions we have. Now, I know some of you are asking questions in your head.
And I'm also fine with questions in the chat if folks can't unmute or are not comfortable speaking your questions. I did not watch the chat while I was speaking because I am hugely distractible, and it would have been a total train wreck. But I definitely see that there's a lot of stuff in there, a lot of comments. I see the number, but I haven't scrolled through them.
So I'd like to ask a question, if I might. So I've been listening to what you're saying about, particularly about trying to define religion, and it's this idea of self-definition and the sacred, and your connection to the sacred. And I guess when I think of religion and spirituality, and again, very simplistic terms, that religion has communal aspect to it, and spirituality seems more individually based. But I wonder still, as I've been listening to you, given all that you've said, if you have some frame that you would put around religion now, based on your experiences, are there certain characteristics that you would use to define religion based on what you've been, the studies you've been doing?
I have two answers to that, and they're a little different from each other because it depends on the context. On the one hand, when it comes to actually trying to figure out what religion is, because the term has varied so much over the centuries, and because the term as we have it today was made up for very particular purposes several hundred years ago, including colonialist purposes, right? The field has nefarious roots, as many academic fields do. That's why I find it so persuasive to be asking, how are words like religion and spirituality mobilized today? How do people use them? How do they think about them? At the same time, there's also something interesting in sort of on my side of religious studies in looking at things that we don't recognize as religion, but that function similarly to religion, that can help us understand more about the power of our various conceptions of the world. So things like nationalism and science. It's really particularly fun telling a bunch of science majors that science functions like a religion, and then trying to convince them all of that. But there are ways in which sort of totalizing perspectives on the world that drive, that undergird everything about how we interact with the world around us, those function in the same way that religion does. So in raising those kinds of questions, it's difficult to do that without having some sort of a sense of what religion is. But in that context, we're often using what's typically referred to as the functionalist definition of religion, asking what religion does rather than what it is, and how these different things do similar things. And we might learn from those comparisons. Think, for instance, of a lifelong activist dedication to a cause, of revolutionaries' commitment to risking and sometimes even giving up their lives for something that is really important to them. And sometimes that's a religion, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a particular idea of freedom. Sometimes it's a particular people, wide variety of things, right? A particular ideology. And that profound level of commitment that can drive people to give their lives for a cause, that's something that is shared across these different perspectives. To think about that through the lens of how particular conceptions of the world can be orienting and can impact everything about how you interact with that world, about how you perceive what goes on around you. That is a particular kind of definition of religion, but it starts with what religion does. So again, my definitions are always more observational than anything else. I'm on a side of the field that's heavily rooted in phenomenology, and my own work is profoundly rooted in post-structuralist theory. And so between those two, there really isn't a capital T truth. I'm much more interested in what is capital T truth for other people and what that then does in the world.
I have a kind of follow-up question to that, Melissa, about the definition of religion and how you use it. Unless I missed it, and I might have, you didn't actually refer explicitly to this sort of very common, albeit contested definition of religion as having to do with kind of binding, which I think would have, if you wanted to adopt that view of religion, would work very well with your interest in BDSM. And I just wonder if you could make a comment about that. And it might just be that you don't accept that view of religion, but I'm just curious.
Sure. Yeah. And so for those of you that aren't familiar with that, it comes from the root words. So re and ligio, ligio related to like the word ligament. Again, I think because of the nature of the work I do, to start with, yes, it's a super fun wordplay. Absolutely, you're right, and I have to admit it's not one that had occurred to me, at least not as far as I remember. But these days, maybe it's in something I wrote before the pandemic wiped out my mind. But again, because I'm starting with how the people that I work with and the people that I learn from understand things, it really starts there. So you won't find, now mind you, I have the honor sometimes of working with people who are themselves religionists, or who are doing advanced training in the study of religion, either on the side of theology or on the more descriptive analytical side. And I'll never forget the interview with the sister who sighed and looked at me and said, I think I'm really a panentheist. And I just really started laughing because that's not a commonly used term outside of religionist circles. But again, that's kind of where I'm starting from is what do people tell me about how this works? And do you use the word religion or do you use the word spiritual? For most people right now, it's spiritual. What does that actually mean to you? I've had people tell me I'm not spiritual, but my brother's ghost comes over every night. Okay, so spirituality doesn't include your brother's ghost. That's interesting. I'm not going to tell you that's not spirituality. So because I'm coming from that side of things, it would be interesting to see, if I were interviewing folks and they said, oh, hey, somebody once told me there's this root word and isn't that fun? And they can go together. That'll totally show up in the book, but it's kind of not, it's fun to play with, but it's sort of not where I go, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And actually, it leads to another question that someone sent me, which has more to do with your actual method if you weren't constrained by the pandemic. One student sent a question and asked, how do you go about approaching individuals during this type of research? I mean, what's your, it could be a delicate process, right?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And it's also a learning curve for me. So I have all of my career, I've made the practice of studying communities that I have one foot in and one foot out of. So it's always been queer and trans communities, and it's always been queer and trans communities that I'm not part of. That has a couple of advantages for me. One is that I learned very early on that when I write about stuff that is too close to me, I can't distinguish between critiques of my work and critiques of who I am. It also means that I ask really ridiculous, ignorant questions because I don't know any better. And sometimes those are the most helpful and the most revealing. If I'm working with a community that I deeply know, I take a lot of things for granted and don't think to ask about stuff. And sometimes what I'm taking for granted is wrong. But what that means is that I'm not starting with a pre-existing network. With the sisters, it was a matter of approaching the houses that were closest to me. I was in Southeastern Washington at the time. I'm getting to the answer, I promise. I was in Southeastern Washington at the time, and so it was Portland and Seattle, and I approached those houses and said, hey, here's what I'm doing, and would be interested in, in working with you, and was invited to a business meeting, and then they all voted and they said yes. And then there was a huge hitch about a year later when somebody said, you really should talk to the Mother House in San Francisco. And the Mother House in San Francisco said, oh, we have a copyright agreement that you have to sign. And I said, no, that doesn't apply to scholars. And then we had a number of months of sort of sorting that out and me being afraid the whole project was gone. Doesn't work that way with BDSM communities, right? There's conferences and there's bars and there are some organizations, but there's lots of them, and they're not sort of part of the sisters are very clearly any sisters who are listening to this are about to laugh. The sisters are a very clearly defined community. This is not. So honestly, I'm still figuring that out. And even more than with the sisters, and certainly more, well, kind of more than MCC. One of the MCCs that I worked with had a lot of military folks in it before the lifting of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So that was also a space where I did not realize as much as I should have, or as fast as I should have, how careful I needed to be in terms of making clear who I was and that I wasn't putting people at risk. There is a lot of trust building. It starts with that. For sure, every time I talk about this work, somebody says, oh, I'd love to do an interview with you. And this is another thing that I found, is that these are all communities that feel utterly ignored by scholarship, and they are. I hope that the work that I've done has created a space where communities see me as trustworthy. It is always tricky as an academic to balance between representing things generously and representing things honestly. Those are not necessarily different things. But when there are inequities that are happening and some people in the community are suffering from those inequities, it's also important to talk about that in ways that support the community and help it move forward from those. So this is a very long way of saying, yes, it's really important to go slowly. It's really important to earn trust. And I'm still genuinely struggling with how do you do that in a community that is primarily networks and not where I can just sort of pop my head up and say, hey, can I come to this? Because a lot of stuff, the answer is no, right? I have the wrong embodiment. And that also complicates things. I could talk about this a lot more because it's something that I think about a lot and that I think about in depth, and that I'm still struggling with, because you also can't really write anything that genuinely represents the community when you've interviewed, like, 2 people in the Pacific Northwest and 1 person, these are not people I've interviewed, I'm making this up, but 2 people in the Pacific Northwest and 1 person in Texas, and, a small radical fairy circle in Florida. And, it just, that doesn't hang together. So that's something I'm still struggling with, feeling my way forward, except that I can't right now.
That makes sense. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions.
I would love to ask a question. I once presided at a queer leather community wedding in a dungeon, and I was in gear myself. It was incredibly joyful. There were over 100 people in attendance. And the gratitude that I experienced from the attendees to have a clergy person be willing to be fully and joyfully present, like appropriately clothed, not as an outsider, but as a member of the community, even though I was from states away and knew the couple, was both wonderful and so disappointing, right? It was just heartbreaking to see that people had to be that grateful.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know what you've seen about that kind of adaptation, hybridization of mainstream religious practice, where it's intersected with leather and BDSM community, and what that's looked like, or what you might be able to share with us about it. Because I know my experience, but I would love to know what else there is to be known about it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yes, absolutely. I completely resonate with what you're saying. People know that their experiences and their bodies are marginalized and desacralized, and the ability to have religious leaders counter that is life-saving. It is incredibly important. And to have religious leaders who are at whatever level open about, yes, I am part of you too. I am part of this community. There is a decent sized amount. It's not huge, but there is, let's just say, as is typical with progressive work, the theologians get to it before my side of the field does. And there is a decent amount of, I'm going to say religiously committed commentary, because for some people theology is more specifically Christian, for others it's not. But there is a decent amount of religiously committed commentary from, just off the top of my head, the articles that I could actually cite to you immediately, and I'm definitely going to leave things out. There's of course a ton from the pagan community. There's a lot from Christian communities. It helps that Troy Perry and his partner are Leathermen, but that's, MCC isn't the sole place that it's coming from either. Did I say Buddhism already? And then of course, we've got these conversations going on at Savara, the Queer Talmud camp. That's, I think, really where the richest stuff is. And certainly, leather weddings are not enormously unusual. What I think people find unusual is someone from a more mainstream religious tradition being willing to officiate, and as you say, in gear. That's incredibly powerful. It's so affirming, so important. I don't know how much that answered you. Again, I'm so early in the process that I've got a lot of readings, and I know there are probably even folks here in the audience who could answer that question better than I can, but that's what I've got.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
No, it's interesting that at International Mr. Leather here in Chicago, there used to be and there might still be if people were meeting together, a Sunday service. There were CTS people involved in that. I won't name any of them, but it was kind of a big deal. So maybe one more question. I don't want to wear out Melissa. I know how tiring these talks can be, so.
I have a question. I'm curious to know what impact you hope your research would have on religious spaces or institutions. So it's great to think about how BDSM and religion or spirituality might intersect for people, but beyond just describing people's experiences, what do you want people to change or take with them from your research?
I think the important thing for me, and whether this is in religious spaces or spaces that are at least ostensibly non-religious, the important thing for me is inclusion and affirmation. It's what I talked about at the beginning, that the desacralization and demonization of oppressed bodies is soul killing and also life killing. And that matters to me, no matter what religion or spirituality or that's taking place within. As a religionist, as somebody who got fascinated by religion the minute that I learned that people were using it in liberatory ways, which is like the kid of Berkeley professors was a total and utter shock to me, especially in the time of the rise of the religious so-called right. I have always not just been intellectually interested, but been passionately committed to the critical importance of affirming, welcoming, celebratory religious and spiritual spaces for trans and queer folks. Doing that as a religious practitioner is not my calling, but doing it as a scholar and writing things that hopefully other people will read and either see themselves reflected in or think more about the spaces that they are dismissing, whether it's religious studies scholars in the classroom, or even in the context of, so unfortunately, the definitions of religion also have a profound impact on the law, because religion is addressed in our Constitution, but the Constitution doesn't say what religion is. So even in those kinds of cases, mind you, I'm not expecting my work to end up in the Supreme Court, but that has happened with some religionists, and even in those kinds of cases, I think it is dangerous to define what counts as religion and what doesn't in a country where religion is a part of federal law, because that can have unintended consequences. And there are scholars much better than I am at these things that have written extensively about this. I'm thinking especially of Winnie Sullivan, but they're at Indiana University, but there are many others. But at the same time, I think at least putting this kind of stuff out there to say, hey, we're leaving bodies behind and that disproportionately impacts people. Yeah, I hope in some way, this is a big ambition, and I don't know how much it actually happens, but this is why I do what I do, is that I hope in some way my work intervenes in the internalized oppression that many trans and queer folks feel from religion.
Thank you, Melissa. Let's all thank Melissa for a wonderful lecture. Thoughtful, provocative. That was really very well done. So however you think on Zoom.
Thank you all for being here. I'm grateful. I wish we were all in an auditorium. I wish we were going out for drinks afterwards, but I'm very grateful, and I'm emailable.
Great. And I believe I am turning it over to Lisa Zook right now.
Thanks. Yes. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Ken. Congratulations, Mac. I'd like to take to invite now Jeff Lisa Simpson, who was one of last year's Castaneda scholars and who is my friend, to close us with some words of sending. Jeff Lisa.
Thank you, Lisa. But you only kind of got my name right there. And because we're at Castaneda, I must pause here to correct that. You see, earlier this year, I participated in a course here at CTS where we created rituals to celebrate various theologies, including, of course, the ritualizing of queer theology. Now, as we've learned tonight, many queer liturgies invoke parody, using the campy, the sarcastic, the creative, and the witty, and what some might label a rebellious side of queerness. So in that assignment in that class, my small group decided to create a ritual that was fueled with those characteristics. We invited our classmates to join us at what we named the Church of Haldeman to celebrate as we were baptized and christened in our new queer identities that reflected our passions, honored our ancestral mentors, and celebrated our freedoms and privilege to be queer. After my peers baptized me in the name of the divine Miss M, in the name of the songbird known as Babs, and of the musical spirit captured in the Broadway version of Les Miserables, I was christened in my new name, Lisa Jeff Bridget Latrice Rose Boyce Rainier Simpson, lover of all handsome men, and child of Ruth and Naomi, David and Jonathan, and Ahab and Jezebel, a humbly grateful daughter of the House of Haldeman, or I guess JL for short. I see so many of my siblings from that House of Haldeman, and I invite those of you who participated in that ritual to write your names from that day in the chat if you remember them. I also invite all of us gathered here to think about your own majestic queer identities and name yourself out to the universe or in the chat in whatever names that express how wonderfully and beautifully queer you are. And yes, I know there are some here who are present who might say, but I'm not queer. To you, I will say to you what I once said to a friend, a Mr. Watts, as we walked together to begin our very first day at CTS. As we learned more about each other while we walked, my new friend looked at me and said, so you're queer. I looked at him and I said, Shay, we are all queer. God has created us queerly different from one another, and that is fabulous. It's just that some of us, Shay, embrace the beauty of our queerness sooner than others. So yes, join me. Let us imagine now who we all are in our individual queer identities, or who we hope to become, as I send us this evening with the following blessing. Gracious and merciful divine spirit, known by many names, we are blessed in our knowing that you see persons as people, beautiful in their diversity, whether it be cultural, age, gender identity, sexuality, nationality, race, creed, or color. We pray that these realities may be lifted up and made holy, that our queerness, as defined in our diversity, will become channels of blessings, peace, and understanding. That a positive spirit to respect others for who they are and to be forbearing toward others and their self-expression will bring us closer to the dawning of the new covenant symbolized by the setting of a rainbow over the glorious diversity on this planet. A rainbow of hope after enduring the storms that we have survived. Bless those who gather here as we venture into our individual pockets of queerness, celebrating it as we go from this place. In the many names of all that is queerly divine, amen.
Amen. Thank you, everybody.